There was a moment in New York City when the greatest metropolis on earth looked like it was dying. The streets were littered with uncollected garbage. The subway cars were entombed, floor to ceiling, in spray paint. Half the streetlights on some blocks didn't work at all. And in the fall of 1975, the city that had built the skyscraper, that had welcomed millions through Ellis Island, that had powered the American century, went to Washington, hat in hand, and asked for a bailout to keep from going bankrupt. The president said no. A famous newspaper headline put it in 5 blunt words: Ford to city, drop dead. That single sentence captured everything about New York in the 1970s, a decade when the city seemed to be falling apart in plain sight, and yet, somehow, in the middle of all that decay, it was quietly becoming the most creative place on the planet. To understand the 70s in New York, you have to understand what came before. The city had spent the post-war decades losing its industrial base, its manufacturing jobs, its middle class, piece by piece, to the suburbs and to other regions of the country. By the time the 70s arrived, the tax base had shrunk, but the cost of running a city its size had not. Landlords in the Bronx and Brooklyn found it was cheaper to burn their buildings for insurance money than to maintain them, and entire blocks went up in flames. Firefighters in the South Bronx were putting out so many fires a night that the area became a grim symbol for urban collapse everywhere. When people talk about cities burning in America, they are often picturing, whether they know it or not, the South Bronx of 1975. Times Square, once the glittering heart of Broadway glamour, had become something else entirely. The marquees that used to advertise big band orchestras and movie premieres now advertised peep shows and grindhouse theaters. 42nd Street earned the nickname The Deuce, and it was equal parts spectacle and warning, a place tourists were told to avoid after dark, and sometimes even in daylight. Prostitution, drug dealing, and petty crime operated in the open, not because anyone approved of it, but because the city simply didn't have the resources, or in some years the will, to police it the way it once had. And then there was July of 1977, the summer that seemed to sum up the entire decade in 25 hours. A massive blackout hit the city, and unlike the calm, almost communal blackout of 1965 where strangers had helped each other through the dark with candlelight and good humor, this one turned into a different kind of night. Looting broke out across dozens of neighborhoods. Store windows were smashed. Over 1,000 fires were set. More than 3,000 people were arrested in a single night, the largest mass arrest in the city's history up to that point. It felt, to a lot of people watching from outside, like the final proof that New York had lost control of itself. That same summer, the city was gripped by a different kind of fear. A killer calling himself the Son of Sam had been terrorizing young couples for almost a year, and by the summer of '77, panic had spread through the boroughs. Nightclubs emptied out early. Women dyed their hair, afraid of the killer's supposed preference for brunettes. It was a summer where the city's 2 great crises, one born of poverty and neglect, the other born of pure random terror, collided at the exact same moment, under the exact same heat. But here is the strange and beautiful thing about New York in the 70s, the thing that makes this decade so endlessly fascinating to look back on. While City Hall was broke and the Bronx was burning and Times Square had become a punchline, something extraordinary was happening in the cracks. Rent was cheap, almost absurdly cheap by today's standards, because nobody wanted to live in a city that seemed to be collapsing. And when rent is cheap, artists move in. That's exactly what happened in a rundown stretch of Lower Manhattan that used to be full of empty factory buildings. Painters and sculptors moved into those abandoned lofts because nobody else wanted them, and a neighborhood called Soho was born almost by accident, becoming one of the most influential art scenes in the world by the end of the decade. Down on the Bowery, in a shabby little bar with a leaking roof, a scene was forming that would change music forever. CBGB was originally supposed to stand for country, bluegrass, and blues, but almost nobody who played there stuck to that plan. Instead, bands like Television, the Ramones, Blondie, Talking Heads, and Patti Smith turned the grimy little room into the birthplace of American punk rock. These weren't polished, major label acts. They were kids with cheap guitars and a lot of nerve, making music that reflected the raw, stripped down, anything goes atmosphere of the city itself. The music sounded the way the city looked, sharp edges, no polish, and completely alive. Uptown, in the very same Bronx that was burning on the news every night, something else entirely was being invented. At house parties and in community centers, young DJs were taking 2 copies of the same record and looping the instrumental break back and forth, extending the part of the song where dancers went wildest. A DJ named Kool Herc is often credited as the father of this new sound, and MCs began talking, rhyming, and hyping the crowd over those extended breaks. What started as block party entertainment in a neighborhood the rest of the country had written off would grow, within a generation, into hip-hop, one of the most influential musical and cultural movements in modern history. It's almost impossible to overstate the irony. The most abandoned, most disparaged part of the entire city was quietly giving birth to a sound that would eventually be heard on every continent on Earth. And then, just a few miles south, in the middle of all this grit, there was Studio 54. If the Bronx was where the poor and forgotten were creating something from nothing, Studio 54 was where the rich and the famous went to lose themselves completely. Opening in 1977, it became the most famous nightclub the world had ever seen, a place where Andy Warhol, Bianca Jagger, Michael Jackson, and Liza Minnelli might all be dancing under the same disco ball on the same night. The doorman would look out over the crowd gathered outside and simply point, choosing who got in based on nothing more than how interesting they looked. Fashion designers, drag queens, Wall Street executives, and total unknowns were all mixed together on that dance floor, in a city that, outside those velvet ropes, could barely keep the lights on. That contrast, more than anything else, is what defines New York in the 1970s. It was a decade of collapse and a decade of creation happening at exactly the same time, in exactly the same place. The subway cars were falling apart mechanically, breaking down constantly, while their exteriors became a rolling gallery for young graffiti artists like Lee Quinones and Dondi, who treated the entire transit system as their canvas, whether the city wanted them to or not. What officials saw as vandalism, art critics would later study as one of the most significant graffiti movements of the 20th century. By the very end of the decade, the city had scraped its way back from the edge of bankruptcy through painful budget cuts, union concessions, and a slow, grinding rebuild of public confidence. The famous I Love New York campaign, with its bold red heart, launched in 1977, right in the middle of the chaos, an attempt to convince both tourists and New Yorkers themselves that the city still had something worth loving. And in a strange way, it worked, not because the campaign fixed anything overnight, but because it captured a spirit that had never actually left. Even at its lowest point, financially broke, politically abandoned, and physically crumbling, New York in the 1970s was proving something remarkable, that creativity doesn't need comfort to thrive. Sometimes it needs exactly the opposite. It needs empty buildings and cheap rent and a city too distracted by its own survival to notice what was being built in its shadows. The New York of the 70s didn't just survive its own decline. It used that decline as raw material, and in doing so, it built the cultural foundation, in music, in art, in fashion, and in sheer nerve, that the entire world is still drawing from today.